In the late 1930s, a young German couple could be deeply in love and still be denied the right to marry. Not because of money, not because of age, but because of blood. Before vows could be spoken, forms had to be filled out. Family trees unfolded across desks. Doctors measured bodies. Officials examined photographs, names, and medical histories. Only after the state was satisfied could love proceed. In the Third Reich, affection was tolerated. Reproduction was required. The Nazi leadership believed Germany's future depended not only on tanks and armies, but on bedrooms, wombs, and birth certificates. Marriage became policy. Children became currency. And the promise of a better life became a tool to engineer a white future. This was not a metaphor. It was written into law. The obsession with race that defined the Third Reich did not emerge suddenly in 1933, nor was it born in laboratories or universities. It grew out of fear. Fear carefully cultivated, repeated, and institutionalized until it felt self-evident. To understand how the Nazis turned marriage and reproduction into tools of state policy, one must first understand the myth they sold to millions of ordinary Germans. The idea that the nation was biologically endangered, and that its survival depended on controlling who loved whom, who married, and who was allowed to have children. This was the foundation of the so-called white future. Germany entered the 1930s deeply traumatized. The First World War had left millions dead, the economy shattered, and the political system unstable. Birth rates had fallen steadily since the late 19th century, accelerating during the war and its aftermath. Urbanization had pulled families away from rural life. Women were increasingly present in the workforce. Traditional social hierarchies were shifting. None of this was unique to Germany, but the Nazis framed it as an existential racial crisis. In speeches, pamphlets, schoolbooks, and newspapers, the same argument appeared again and again. Germans were not merely losing power, they were disappearing. The nation, it was claimed, was being weakened from within by declining fertility, degenerate lifestyles, and racial mixing. This narrative did not rely on statistics alone. It relied on emotion. Fear was easier to mobilize than data. The regime portrayed the German people as a living body, one that could be strengthened or poisoned. War, in this framing, was not the greatest danger. Biology was. Tanks could be rebuilt. Bloodlines, once diluted, could not. From the very beginning, Nazi ideology treated demography as destiny. The term Aryan had no consistent scientific meaning, even by the standards of early 20th century racial theory. Anthropologists, linguists, and racial ideologues disagreed openly about its definition. Some focused on skull measurements, others on language groups, others on vague notions of Nordic spirit. But the lack of clarity was not a weakness. It was an advantage. Because Aryan was never precisely defined, it could be endlessly reshaped by the state. What mattered was not objective classification, but authority. The regime reserved the right to decide who belonged to the future and who did not. Propaganda presented the Aryan ideal visually, rather than scientifically. Posters showed tall, blonde families standing in fields of wheat, bathed in sunlight. Mothers were healthy and serene. Fathers were strong, disciplined, protective. Children were numerous, smiling, and unmistakably white. This imagery was not accidental. It linked race to nature, fertility, and inevitability. The Aryan family was presented not as a political construct, but as something ancient, organic, and under threat. The enemy, by contrast, was abstract. Degeneration, decay, contamination. These were not individual people in the propaganda. They were forces. Faceless, creeping, corrupting. Once, race was framed as a struggle between growth and extinction. Control became a moral necessity. The racial myth was introduced early and reinforced constantly. Children learned it in classrooms long before they encountered it in law. School curricula were rewritten to include racial biology. Textbooks explained heredity using simplified, moralized examples. Charts illustrated healthy and unhealthy family trees. Lessons linked physical appearance to character traits and destiny. The goal was not to create scientists, it was to create certainty. By adolescence, German children were expected to understand that love was not simply a matter of emotion, but of responsibility. Choosing a partner was framed as choosing the future of the nation. Desire without discipline was dangerous. Attraction without racial awareness was selfish. This education produced a generation that did not need to be coerced into accepting racial policy. They had been prepared to expect it. Within this worldview, women occupied a central position, not as political actors, but as biological assets. The regime defined womanhood primarily through motherhood. This was not merely cultural rhetoric. It was tied directly to the survival narrative. If the nation was a body, women were its reproductive organs. Their personal aspirations were secondary to their biological function. Public discourse praised women not for independence or achievement, but for sacrifice. The ideal woman did not ask what she wanted. She asked what Germany needed. Motherhood was framed as heroism. Bearing children was equated with service. Propaganda compared the pain of childbirth to the sacrifice of soldiers at the front. Both, it was said, served the same cause. This comparison was powerful and deeply manipulative. By elevating motherhood while stripping it of personal autonomy, the regime created a moral trap. Women who did not or could not have children were quietly stigmatized. Childlessness became suspicious. Fertility became virtue. Love, in this system, was no longer an end in itself. It was a means. Once race was defined as fragile and reproduction as urgent, the logic of intervention followed naturally. If the future depended on blood, then the state had a duty to protect that blood. This belief justified intrusion into the most intimate aspects of life. Marriage, sexuality, and reproduction were no longer private matters. They were strategic resources. Just as the state regulated industry and agriculture, it claimed the right to regulate families. The regime did not initially present this as repression. It presented it as care. Policies were framed as support for healthy Germans. Restrictions were described as protection against degeneration. Exclusion was justified as necessity. In speeches and writings, Adolf Hitler repeatedly emphasized that the individual existed only as part of the racial whole. Personal happiness was meaningful only if it aligned with national survival. Freedom, he argued, was dangerous when divorced from biological responsibility. In this worldview, love without racial discipline was not romantic. It was reckless. What made the system effective was not terror alone, but participation. Millions of Germans internalized the logic of racial destiny. They began to evaluate themselves and others through its lens. Family conversations echoed propaganda. Dating choices reflected political ideals. Parents worried not only about their children's happiness, but about their suitability. This is where the myth of the white future became truly powerful. It did not require constant enforcement. It enforced itself. When people believe the future is under threat, they accept control. When they believe reproduction is a form of defense, they accept intrusion. When they believe love can endanger the nation, they begin to police their own desires. By the time laws were passed to regulate marriage and childbirth, the groundwork had already been laid. The myth had become common sense. This chapter of Nazi ideology is often misunderstood as irrational fanaticism. In reality, it was disturbingly systematic. First came the narrative, decline, contamination, extinction. Then the ideal, the white, fertile, disciplined family. Then the moral duty, reproduce correctly or betray the future. Only after this psychological transformation did the legal machinery move into place. Marriage restrictions, racial examinations, financial incentives. These were not the origin of the system. They were its execution. The white future was not simply imagined. It was planned. And once a society accepts the idea that its survival depends on controlling love, everything that follows becomes possible. In Nazi Germany, the decision to marry was no longer a private step between two people. It was a request, an application, a test, and in many cases a verdict. By the mid-1930s, the regime had moved from abstract racial theory to concrete administrative control. Love, which propaganda celebrated endlessly, was no longer sufficient on its own. It had to be verified, approved, and certified. The state claimed the authority to decide not only who belonged to the future, but who was allowed to create it. This transformation did not happen overnight, and it did not apply equally to everyone. Its most rigid form appeared inside the SS, the organization the regime viewed not just as a political and military elite, but as a biological one. For SS men, marriage was not a personal milestone. It was an extension of service. An SS officer who wished to marry was required to submit a formal request for permission. Without approval, the marriage was forbidden. Unauthorized unions could end careers, lead to disciplinary action, or result in expulsion from the organization. In a system where status, income, and social standing were tightly linked to political loyalty, this was a powerful form of pressure. The application itself was exhaustive. The man was required to document his ancestry in meticulous detail, often tracing family lines back to the year 1800. Birth certificates, church records, and local registries were collected, examined, and cross-checked. Any uncertainty, any missing record could delay or derail the process entirely. The woman was scrutinized just as closely, often more so. Her background was investigated not only for racial origin, but for health, reputation, and perceived moral character. Medical examinations were mandatory. Doctors assessed physical traits, hereditary risks, and reproductive potential. Family histories were combed for signs of mental illness, disability, alcoholism, or anything that might suggest biological weakness. Photographs were attached to the file, not romantic portraits, but standardized images meant to display facial features clearly. These images were not symbolic. They were evidence. Love letters played no role in the decision. Emotional compatibility was irrelevant. The state did not ask whether the couple loved each other. It asked whether their children would be useful. Many applications were rejected. Sometimes the reasons were blunt. A Jewish grandparent, a diagnosis of epilepsy in a distant relative, a family history deemed unreliable. In other cases, the justification was vague, cloaked in bureaucratic language about suitability or long-term health risks. Appeals were possible but rarely successful. For the couples involved, the experience was humiliating and destabilizing. Private relationships were pulled into the open, dissected by officials who would never meet the people whose futures they decided. Intimacy was translated into paperwork. Yet remarkably, many accepted this process not as an intrusion, but as confirmation of belonging. Approval carried meaning. It signaled that one was not merely tolerated by the state, but valued. Couples who received permission often described relief and pride. The regime had judged them worthy of the future. This psychological dynamic was crucial. The system did not function through fear alone. It functioned through validation. Beyond the SS, similar principles were gradually extended to the broader population. Marriage was officially encouraged, but only within rigid racial boundaries. Relationships across prohibited lines were criminalized, publicly condemned, and increasingly surveilled. The state presented itself as a guardian, protecting Germans from bad choices. Propaganda framed racial restrictions not as punishment, but as care. To prevent a mistake in love, was portrayed as an act of responsibility toward future generations. This logic seeped into everyday life. Parents discouraged relationships they believed might draw unwanted attention. Friends whispered warnings. Employers took note of personal associations. The line between private life and political loyalty blurred until it nearly vanished. In this environment, love became cautious. Desire was filtered through calculation. Before falling in love, people learned to ask not, "Do I feel something?" but "Is this allowed?" The most revealing aspect of the system was how deeply it normalized itself. By the late 1930s, many Germans no longer experienced marriage restrictions as extraordinary. They experienced them as procedure, forms, interviews, waiting periods. The bureaucracy of love had become routine. Behind this system stood a broader ideological conviction articulated repeatedly by Adolf Hitler and other Nazi officials: that individual happiness was meaningless if it endangered the collective future. Marriage, they argued, was not an expression of freedom, but a responsibility to the race. The right to reproduce had to be earned. This belief transformed the state into a gatekeeper of intimacy. The consequences extended far beyond those who were rejected outright. Even approved marriages were shaped by the system's expectations. Couples entered relationships already conditioned by ideology. They had learned that their union was not simply about companionship or love, but about contribution. Children were anticipated not as personal joy, but as obligation. A successful marriage was one that produced results. Those who failed, who remained childless, who experienced infertility, who lost children, often internalized guilt. The regime had framed reproduction as duty. Failure felt like betrayal. What made the system especially effective was its apparent rationality. It did not present itself as cruel. It presented itself as logical. If the future depended on blood, then regulating blood was sensible. If the nation was fragile, then discipline was necessary. If love could threaten survival, then love had to be supervised. By the time the system was fully operational, many no longer questioned its premise. They debated only its details. This is how control becomes invisible. Marriage, one of the most intimate human bonds, was stripped of its unpredictability. It was standardized, evaluated, and aligned with ideology. Love was allowed, but only within carefully drawn lines. Outside those lines, there was no appeal to emotion, only silence. The Third Reich did not abolish marriage. It redefined it. And once marriage belonged to the state, everything that followed, rewards for the right families, pressure on women, and the industrial management of reproduction, became not only possible, but inevitable. By the late 1930s, the Third Reich had moved beyond persuasion. The racial myth was established, marriage was regulated, and intimacy was already filtered through ideology. What remained was the most effective step of all: payment. The regime understood something fundamental about human behavior. Fear could discipline, and belief could motivate, but incentives could normalize obedience. If the future depended on producing the right children, then reproduction had to become economically rational. Love alone was unreliable, but rewards could be calculated. This was how the Nazis turned childbirth into a transaction. The policy was presented as social support, even generosity. In reality, it was a system designed to reward biological conformity and punish deviation without always appearing violent. It replaced brute force with accounting. In 1933, the government introduced the Ehestandsdarlehen, the marriage loan. On paper, it looked progressive. Young couples who met racial criteria could receive an interest-free loan from the state to help them start a household. At a time of unemployment and economic instability, this was appealing. Many couples applied immediately. But the structure of the loan revealed its true purpose. For every child born to the couple, 25% of the debt was erased. 4 children meant full forgiveness. The state did not hide this logic. It was advertised openly. Children were not only encouraged, they were priced. The message was clear and consistent. Reproduction would be rewarded, and the reward would be tangible. A child was no longer only a personal joy or burden. It was an economic asset. This policy worked. Marriage rates rose sharply in the early years of the regime. Birth rates followed. The state celebrated the numbers as proof that Germany was recovering. Newspapers printed statistics alongside photographs of smiling families. Propaganda framed these trends as a national awakening. But what was rarely discussed was who qualified. The loans were not universal. Couples had to prove racial suitability. Background checks, medical evaluations, and genealogical investigations determined access. Those deemed unfit were excluded entirely. For them, there were no loans, no forgiveness, no assistance. Social policy became a filtering mechanism. The regime expanded the incentive structure beyond loans. Tax reductions favored large families. Mothers were encouraged to leave the workforce, and doing so increased eligibility for benefits. Employment protections shielded valuable mothers while marginalizing women who did not conform to the reproductive ideal. Motherhood became a recognized economic role, but only under strict conditions. Public recognition reinforced the system. In 1938, the regime introduced the Cross of Honor of the German Mother. It was awarded in 3 classes: bronze, silver, and gold, based on the number of children a woman bore. The ceremonies were public. The symbolism was deliberate. Medals had once been reserved for soldiers. Now, they were pinned to mothers. The comparison was not subtle. Just as men sacrificed their bodies for the nation in war, women were expected to sacrifice their lives to reproduction. Childbirth was framed as a battlefield, the womb as a front line. Pain, exhaustion, and even death were recast as patriotic contribution. This narrative placed immense pressure on women. To refuse motherhood was not neutral. It was suspect. To struggle with fertility was not tragic. It was inadequate. The state did not always punish failure directly, but it ensured that success was visible and celebrated. What the regime achieved was not simply higher birth rates, but self-surveillance. Women compared themselves to others. Families measured worth through numbers. Communities internalized the logic of reward and absence. At the center of this system stood Adolf Hitler himself, not as a benevolent provider, but as the architect of a worldview in which economic support was inseparable from racial value. He repeatedly argued that the state existed to protect and expand the racial core of the nation. Social benefits were not rights, they were investments. This distinction mattered. Because benefits were framed as investments, they could be withdrawn. Because support was conditional, it created dependency. Families that relied on the system had reason to conform, to remain silent, to avoid scrutiny. The promise of material stability bound private life to political loyalty. Few symbols illustrate this better than the so-called People's Car. In 1938, the regime announced the KDF wagon, a car that would be affordable for the German worker. The concept was revolutionary. Ordinary families, it was promised, would finally own automobiles. Mobility, leisure, and modernity were within reach. The propaganda surrounding the car was saturated with imagery of family life. Parents and children traveling together. Healthy bodies, open roads, a peaceful future. The car was never presented as a luxury. It was presented as the natural reward for disciplined citizenship. Workers paid into savings plans month after month. The sums were not insignificant. For many, the payments required sacrifice. Yet participation was widespread, driven by trust in the promise and the desire to belong. Very few ever received the car. War redirected production. Factories were repurposed. The savings remained locked. The promise dissolved without ceremony. But the effect had already been achieved. The car had never been the true incentive. The incentive was the belief that conformity would be rewarded, that sacrifice would be repaid, that the future was tangible and attainable if one followed the rules. This belief sustained compliance, even when reality contradicted it. The regime's demographic policy also created stark contrasts. While valuable families were rewarded, others were systematically excluded. People with disabilities, hereditary illnesses, or stigmatized backgrounds were not simply ignored. They were removed from the equation entirely. Forced sterilization targeted hundreds of thousands. Families were broken quietly, bureaucratically, without public acknowledgement. These actions occurred alongside celebrations of motherhood and fertility, creating a chilling dual reality: life for some, erasure for others. The same state that awarded medals for childbirth authorized surgeries to prevent it. This contradiction was not accidental. It was structural. By tying benefits to racial criteria, the regime transformed reproduction into a zero-sum system. One group's reward depended on another group's exclusion. Compassion was conditional. Support was selective. The economic logic reinforced the moral one. What emerged was a society in which having children was no longer simply a personal decision, but a calculated interaction with power. Families learned to navigate incentives. Women learned to interpret their bodies as resources. Men learned to measure success not only by career, but by output. Love existed, but it operated within narrow margins. The most insidious aspect of the system was how ordinary it became. There were no daily announcements of coercion, no constant threats. Instead, there were forms, benefits, ceremonies, and statistics. Control was embedded in routine. People adapted. By the early 1940s, the idea that the state had a legitimate interest in reproduction no longer seemed radical to many. It seemed practical, necessary, even generous. This is how authoritarian systems endure, not by constant violence, but by aligning survival with obedience. When the war turned against Germany, the system did not collapse immediately. Women continued to bear children amid bombing raids. Mothers still received medals. The language of sacrifice intensified as reality worsened, but the promises grew hollow. By 1945, the future that had been bought and paid for lay in ruins. The men were dead or missing. The benefits vanished. The medals meant nothing. Women who had been told they were building eternity found themselves standing in rubble. The regime had demanded everything: love, bodies, children, and delivered destruction. What remained were the consequences. Generations shaped by a system that had turned intimacy into policy and reproduction into currency. The Third Reich did not simply encourage families. It monetized blood. By the early 1940s, the Third Reich no longer spoke about motherhood as a personal choice. It spoke about it as a function, a role assigned, measured, rewarded, and, when necessary, disciplined. The transition was subtle. There was no single decree declaring that women now belonged to the state. Instead, the regime surrounded motherhood with so much ideological weight, social pressure, and material consequence that opting out became almost impossible. To be a woman in Nazi Germany was to live under the constant assumption that one's body had a public purpose. From the beginning, the regime framed women as the biological infrastructure of the nation. Men fought wars. Women produced soldiers. This division was repeated so often that it became common sense. Posters, speeches, radio broadcasts, and school programs all reinforced the same equation. The front line and the home front were equally vital, and women served on both, whether they wished to or not. This framing transformed pregnancy into duty. Giving birth was no longer an intimate family event. It was a contribution to national survival. The pain of childbirth was openly compared to the pain of combat. Losses were rationalized the same way. A soldier who died for Germany was a hero. A woman who died giving birth was also a hero. The logic left no room for refusal. As the war intensified and casualties mounted, this pressure increased. The state needed more bodies, and it turned insistently to those who could produce them. Women were urged, sometimes gently, sometimes aggressively, to prioritize reproduction over all other aspects of life. Careers were discouraged. Education was redirected. Independence was reframed as selfishness. The language used to describe childless women revealed the cruelty of the system. They were not openly condemned in most cases, but they were described as incomplete, unreliable, or suspect. Their loyalty was questioned. Their value was uncertain. In a society where worth was increasingly measured in biological output, absence was a kind of failure. This pressure did not always come directly from officials. Often it came from neighbors, family members, co-workers. The regime had succeeded in outsourcing enforcement. Women monitored each other. Mothers compared numbers. Communities noticed who conformed and who did not. Public recognition amplified this dynamic. Award ceremonies for mothers were not merely symbolic. They were instructional. They showed the population what was expected and what would be praised. A woman wearing the Mother's Cross was not just honored. She was displayed as an example. Children were taught to salute such women. Newspapers printed their photographs. Their fertility became public property. The psychological effect was profound. Motherhood ceased to be private. It became performative. At the same time, the state maintained a chilling contradiction. While it glorified childbirth among the right women, it aggressively prevented it among others. Forced sterilization programs continued throughout the 1930s and into the war years. People with disabilities, hereditary illnesses, or socially stigmatized backgrounds were denied the future entirely. The message was unmistakable. Some women were expected to give birth endlessly, while others were forbidden to do so at all. This dual system revealed the true nature of Nazi social policy. It was not about protecting families. It was about curating population. Within this framework, love lost whatever autonomy it had left. Relationships were evaluated not by emotional bonds, but by outcomes. A marriage without children was a disappointment. A pregnancy outside approved structures was a problem to be managed. A woman's worth was increasingly tied to numbers. As the war progressed and resources dwindled, the state's promises grew thinner. Material rewards became harder to deliver. Housing was scarce. Food was rationed. Bombing raids destroyed neighborhoods and families alike. Yet the rhetoric did not change. Women were still told they were building the future. They were still urged to endure, still praised for sacrifice, still expected to give more. This gap between promise and reality was one of the most destructive aspects of the system. Women who had structured their lives around the regime's expectations found themselves trapped. They had sacrificed careers, independence, and often personal safety in pursuit of an ideal that was collapsing around them. By the final years of the war, the contradiction was impossible to ignore. The state that demanded children could no longer protect them. The future that had been promised was visibly disintegrating. Yet even then, the language of duty persisted. The regime could not admit failure without undermining the entire logic of sacrifice. To do so would mean acknowledging that motherhood had been exploited, not honored. When the Third Reich collapsed in 1945, it left behind millions of women whose lives had been shaped by policies they had not chosen. Some had believed in the system. Others had simply adapted to survive. All had been affected. The medals lost their meaning overnight. The social status evaporated. The state that had claimed ownership of motherhood disappeared. What remained were bodies exhausted by expectation, families fractured by war, and children born into ruins rather than into the promised future. The Nazi project had treated women as instruments of demography rather than as individuals. It had elevated motherhood rhetorically while stripping it of autonomy. It had demanded sacrifice without accountability. Motherhood had been turned into infrastructure, and when the system failed, that infrastructure was abandoned. The logic that governed marriage, childbirth, and motherhood in the Third Reich did not stop at incentives or pressure. It moved steadily and deliberately toward substitution. When the regime concluded that families could not always be trusted to produce and raise the right children on their own, it introduced a radical solution. The state would step in and take over. This was the origin of Lebensborn. Founded in 1935, Lebensborn was presented to the public as a charitable initiative. Officially, it existed to support racially valuable mothers, particularly unmarried women who might otherwise face social stigma. The program offered discreet medical care, financial assistance, and a safe environment for childbirth. In propaganda, it was framed as compassionate, modern, and humane. In reality, it marked a decisive shift in Nazi demographic policy, from influencing families to replacing them. The program operated on a simple premise. If the future depended on blood, then blood had to be managed with precision. Emotional bonds, social conventions, and parental rights were secondary considerations. What mattered was biological outcome. Lebensborn homes were established across Germany and later expanded into occupied territories. They were carefully controlled spaces where women selected for racial suitability gave birth under state supervision. Admission was not open. Applicants were screened extensively. Physical appearance, ancestry, health records, and ideological reliability were evaluated. Only those who met the criteria were accepted. For many women, Lebensborn offered security in a society that otherwise condemned unmarried mothers. This was not accidental. The regime exploited vulnerability. It offered protection in exchange for compliance, dignity in exchange for surrender. Once inside the system, women discovered that autonomy was limited. The pregnancy belonged not to them, but to the Reich. Medical decisions were standardized. Births were recorded meticulously. Infants were assessed almost immediately after delivery. Measurements were taken. Notes were made. Value was assigned. Children were not welcomed as individuals. They were evaluated as assets. In some cases, mothers were encouraged or pressured to give their children up for adoption by suitable families, connected to the SS or party elite. The language used was telling. This was not separation. It was redistribution. The child was being placed where it could best serve the future. For women who resisted, the pressure was subtle but persistent. Emotional appeals, ideological arguments, promises of the child's better life. The system did not always need force. It relied on authority and inevitability. As the war expanded, Lebensborn's role changed again. In occupied territories, particularly in Eastern Europe, Nazi racial policy took on a more openly violent form. Children who fit the regime's racial criteria were identified, separated from their families, and absorbed into the German system. They were taken from Poland, Ukraine, Slovenia, and elsewhere. Many were toddlers, some were infants. These children were subjected to examinations similar to those applied to German applicants: hair color, eye color, facial structure, health. Those deemed suitable were Germanized, given new names, new identities, new families. Those who failed the tests were often sent back, sometimes to institutions, sometimes to disappear entirely. For the parents left behind, there was rarely explanation or recourse. The loss was bureaucratic, not dramatic. A child was taken, a document was stamped. The family ceased to exist in the eyes of the state. Lebensborn thus became something far more than a maternity program. It became a mechanism for population engineering. What distinguished it from earlier demographic policies was not its cruelty, but its ambition. The regime no longer relied solely on encouraging the right people to reproduce. It actively rearranged children according to racial logic. Parenthood was no longer guaranteed by biology. It was granted by ideology. This had profound consequences for how family was understood. In Nazi ideology, family had always been subordinate to race. Lebensborn made this hierarchy explicit. The bond between mother and child was acknowledged only insofar as it served the state. When it did not, it could be severed without apology. The psychological toll was immense. Many mothers never recovered from the loss of their children. Some spent decades searching, uncertain whether their sons or daughters were alive. Others were told their children had died, only to discover after the war that they had been raised under different names. For the children themselves, the damage was often lifelong. Many grew up unaware of their origins. Others sensed something was wrong but could not articulate it. After 1945, when the system collapsed and records were uncovered, some learned the truth abruptly, discovering that their parents were not their parents, that their names were not their names, that their identities had been assigned. The state that had promised belonging had instead produced permanent dislocation. It is important to understand that Lebensborn was not an aberration. It was the logical extension of everything that came before it. Once the regime accepted the premise that the future could be designed biologically, replacing families became a rational step. The same ideology that regulated marriage, rewarded childbirth, and glorified motherhood also justified removing children from their families. Love was irrelevant if it conflicted with racial utility. Biology overruled emotion. Throughout this process, the language of care never disappeared. Officials spoke of protection, opportunity, and destiny. Violence was hidden behind euphemism. Trauma was reframed as necessity. This rhetorical strategy allowed ordinary administrators, nurses, and clerks to participate without seeing themselves as perpetrators. They were not destroying families, they believed. They were optimizing the future. By the end of the war, the Lebensborn system lay in disarray. Homes were abandoned. Records were incomplete or destroyed. Staff members blended back into civilian life. The children remained. In the ruins of post-war Europe, courts struggled to untangle what had been done. Some children were returned to surviving relatives. Many were not. The damage could not be fully undone. What Lebensborn revealed, more clearly than any speech or law, was the ultimate destination of Nazi social policy. When love, marriage, and motherhood are subordinated to ideology, the family itself becomes expendable. The Third Reich did not merely intrude into private life, it appropriated it. And when the state claimed ownership of the future, it claimed the right to take children quietly, efficiently, and in the name of destiny. Every system that rewards conformity must decide what to do with those who do not fit. In the Third Reich, this decision was made early, implemented methodically, and carried out with a level of bureaucratic calm that concealed its brutality. While some families were encouraged to multiply, others were quietly erased from the future. The exclusion began not with violence, but with language. Certain people were described as burdens, others as unproductive, some as dangerous to the genetic health of the nation. These were not insults in the Nazi system. They were administrative categories. Once assigned, they carried consequences. In 1933, the regime passed the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring. It allowed for the compulsory sterilization of individuals deemed to suffer from conditions believed to be hereditary. The list was broad and vague: mental illness, epilepsy, physical disabilities, alcoholism, even forms of social nonconformity that could be reframed as pathology. The law did not require consent. Special courts were established to process cases. Doctors, judges, and bureaucrats collaborated to determine who would be allowed to reproduce and who would not. The hearings were brief. The evidence was often thin. Appeals were possible in theory and almost never successful in practice. For the people brought before these courts, the experience was dehumanizing. Their bodies became files. Their lives became risks to be managed. The state did not ask who they loved or whether they wished to have children. It asked only whether they were useful. Hundreds of thousands were sterilized in the years that followed. These procedures were not hidden. Hospitals performed them openly. Medical journals discussed them clinically. Doctors framed their work as preventative care, protecting the nation from future suffering. Violence was disguised as medicine. Families were torn apart in silence. Parents watched their children taken for surgery without understanding what was happening or why. Young people discovered that their futures had been closed before they had begun. The loss was often unspoken, absorbed into private grief that had no place in public life. At the same time, propaganda continued to celebrate motherhood and fertility among the right women. This contrast was not accidental. It reinforced the hierarchy at the heart of Nazi ideology. Some lives were meant to expand. Others were meant to end quietly. The system did not rely on chaos or cruelty alone. It relied on order. Medical professionals played a central role. They examined, classified, and decided. Their authority gave the process legitimacy. When a doctor declared someone unfit, it sounded scientific, not ideological. This professional veneer allowed many participants to believe they were acting ethically. What made the exclusion so effective was its normalization. Sterilization was presented as a technical solution to a social problem. There were no mass rallies, no dramatic announcements. There were appointments, consent forms that did not require consent, and procedures scheduled like any other. This normalization extended into everyday attitudes. Neighbors knew, co-workers suspected, families learned not to ask questions. Silence became survival. As the regime's racial ambitions intensified, exclusion widened. Those with disabilities were not only prevented from reproducing, they were increasingly portrayed as drains on resources, especially during wartime. Propaganda emphasized scarcity. Food, housing, and medical care were framed as limited. Someone had to be prioritized. The implication was clear. If the future required sacrifice, then some people would have to be sacrificed first. The boundary between prevention and elimination grew thinner. What began as sterilization laid the groundwork for more radical policies. Once the state accepted the principle that certain lives were unworthy of continuation, it became easier to argue that some lives were unworthy of existence. Yet even at this stage, the regime maintained its language of care. Officials spoke of compassion, of relief from suffering, of protecting families from genetic burden. The cruelty lay not only in the acts themselves, but in the insistence that they were benevolent. This dual reality, reward and erasure, honor and prohibition, defined Nazi social policy. It created a society divided not only by race, but by reproductive permission. To exist was not enough. One had to be allowed to exist. For those excluded, the consequences were lifelong. Sterilization meant the permanent loss of possibility. Relationships were affected. Marriages collapsed. Shame lingered long after the regime fell. Many survivors never spoke of what had been done to them. Their stories did not fit the narrative of heroic motherhood or patriotic sacrifice. They existed outside the carefully curated image of the white future. By the time the war ended, the damage was irreversible. Generations had been altered. Families had been extinguished, not by bombs, but by paperwork. The Nazi project promised renewal. What it delivered was a hierarchy of life, enforced with surgical precision and moral indifference. And beneath the medals, loans, and propaganda lay a simple truth. The future was not shared. It was selected. When the Third Reich collapsed in the spring of 1945, it did not do so gradually or with explanation. It vanished. The institutions that had regulated love, rewarded childbirth, and defined biological worth disintegrated almost overnight. Laws lost authority. Offices were abandoned. Files were burned or left to rot in ruined buildings. The state that had claimed ownership of the future simply ceased to exist. What remained were people. For years, German families had been told they were building something eternal. That sacrifice would be repaid. That obedience would be rewarded. That children born under the right conditions would inherit stability, status, and meaning. In 1945, these promises were exposed for what they had always been: conditional, fragile, and disposable. The men were gone first. Millions were dead, missing, or imprisoned. Husbands who had been celebrated as ideal fathers never returned. The carefully constructed family units collapsed under the weight of absence. Women who had been encouraged or pressured to structure their lives entirely around motherhood now faced survival alone. The medals meant nothing. The Mother's Cross, once worn with pride, became dangerous. Public symbols of loyalty to the fallen regime were liabilities in occupied Germany. Some women hid them. Others destroyed them. The honor that had elevated them socially now marked them as complicit in a defeated ideology. Material support vanished as well. Loans were irrelevant in a collapsed economy. Housing promises dissolved into rubble. Food shortages, displacement, and occupation defined daily life. Mothers who had been told they were pillars of the nation found themselves queuing for rations, caring for children amid ruins, negotiating with occupying authorities who viewed them not as heroines, but as remnants of a criminal state. For many women, the realization was devastating. Everything they had been told to sacrifice for was gone. The children suffered differently, but no less profoundly. Those born into the regime's demographic projects grew up in chaos. Some had no fathers. Others had no legal identity. Many had been displaced, evacuated, or separated during the final months of the war. The promise of belonging was replaced by uncertainty. For children taken through programs like Lebensborn, the collapse was especially cruel. Records were destroyed or scattered. Caretakers disappeared. Some children were reclaimed by biological relatives. Others were not. Many grew up without knowing who they were or where they came from. After the war, attempts were made to undo what had been done. Allied authorities and post-war German institutions sought to locate stolen children, reunite families, and document crimes. But the system had been designed to erase traces. Names had been changed, identities rewritten. In many cases, truth was unrecoverable. The damage was permanent. Women who had been excluded from reproduction, through sterilization or social prohibition, rarely received acknowledgement. Their suffering did not fit the post-war narrative of rebuilding. There were no ceremonies for them, no restitution that could restore what had been taken. Silence continued, now layered with shame and exhaustion. The same society that had judged them biologically unworthy now struggled to confront its own moral collapse. In the ruins of Germany, a new reality emerged. Love returned to the private sphere, not by declaration, but by necessity. There was no state left to approve marriages, reward births, or assign value. Relationships formed amid scarcity, grief, and rebuilding. Families were improvised, fragmented, redefined. Yet the psychological legacy of the regime did not disappear. Many who had lived under the system carried its logic with them. Women who had internalized the idea that worth was measured in children struggled to redefine themselves. Men returned from captivity to a society that no longer recognized the roles they had been promised. Children grew up sensing that their existence had once been calculated, conditional, instrumental. The myth of the white future collapsed, but its traces remained embedded in memory. Post-war trials exposed parts of the system, laws, programs, orders, but they could not fully address the intimate consequences. Courts could judge policies. They could not repair families shaped by coercion, reward, and exclusion. What the collapse revealed most clearly was the nature of the original project. The Third Reich had not sought to strengthen families. It had sought to control reproduction. It had not honored motherhood. It had exploited it. It had not protected the future. It had attempted to manufacture it and failed. When ideology turned love into duty and children into currency, it hollowed out the very bonds it claimed to defend. Once those bonds were subordinated to race and obedience, they could not survive the fall of the system that enforced them. The end of the regime did not bring closure. It left unanswered questions that lingered for generations. Who was stolen? Who was silenced? Who was never allowed to exist? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, how easily did ordinary people accept a world in which love required permission? The collapse of the Third Reich did not simply mark the defeat of a state. It marked the failure of an idea, that the future can be engineered by controlling intimacy, that humanity can be sorted, rewarded, and erased without consequence. The ruins of 1945 stood as quiet evidence. Love cannot be bred, families cannot be manufactured, and a future built on exclusion will always collapse under its own weight. When the Third Reich disappeared, it took its rules with it. No more forms, no more approvals, no more medals or promises. Love returned to people quietly, without ceremony, imperfect, fragile, and human again. But it did not return untouched. For years, intimacy in Nazi Germany had been conditioned, measured, and judged. People had learned to weigh desire against permission, affection against usefulness. They had learned that love could be wrong, not morally, but biologically, that marriage could be denied, that children could be counted, rewarded, or forbidden. Those lessons did not vanish in 1945. Women who had been told their worth lay in childbirth struggled to define themselves outside that role. Men who had been promised legacy through bloodlines returned to a world that no longer recognized those promises. Children grew up sensing that their existence had once been planned, or prevented, by forces far beyond their control. The most enduring damage was not physical. It was psychological. The regime had done something subtle and devastating. It had taught people to mistrust their own instincts, to doubt love, to calculate intimacy, to believe that the most private parts of life were subject to external judgment. This is how totalitarian systems endure long after they fall. They do not survive through laws alone, but through habits of thought. The Nazis did not invent family values. They distorted them. They took universal human desires, belonging, continuity, love, and turned them into instruments of exclusion. They promised stability, but delivered dependency. They praised motherhood, but stripped it of choice. They spoke of the future, but decided who was allowed to have one. In the end, the promise collapsed because it was built on control rather than trust. A society cannot be sustained by breeding plans and racial arithmetic. Love cannot survive when it requires permission. The ruins of 1945 proved this. What remains today is a warning written not only in laws and archives, but in lives quietly altered. When a state claims authority over intimacy, over who may love, marry, and give birth, it does not strengthen society. It hollows it out. The future is not something that can be engineered through blood. It can only be chosen, freely, imperfectly, and without fear. And when that freedom is taken away, what is lost is not just choice. It is humanity itself.